Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. We're going to talk about Giuseppe Balsamo's Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. It's volume 1 of the trilogy of disclosures from the Necronomicon fragment. So Balsamo's trilogy has the Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, Hermeticism of Hastur, and the Alchemy of Azathoth as the 3 volumes. And each one of them focuses on kind of framing Lovecraft's Great Old Ones mythos in the context of topics that resonate with them. So, for example, Nyarlathotep is seen as this potentially Egyptian god. He transcends time. There's a question of immortality. Perhaps there's a question of resurrection here. And that leads us to this necromancy concept, especially when one goes back to the idea of, what has been lost in the past. So the idea of, let's just take it from Lovecraftian kind of cosmic genealogy, let's call it. The great old ones came from the past. They came from the stars. We can posit in the middle of Egypt, maybe Atlantis. So there's an Atlantean past. Atlantis sinks, R'lyeh sinks, R'lyeh rises, Atlantis rises, dying and rising, necromancy, right? And also just this hypnotic way of Nyarlathotep works. So first volume, Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, and we'll talk about this one in our podcast today. But other volumes in the series continue with Hastur, the yellow sign, as and its relation to Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and the idea of the hidden world. The yellow sign, lost Carcosa, the madness of the king in yellow. And then, surprisingly enough, the pastoral and the pasture. We have the Ambrose Bierce poems, and then the Christian pastoral. And we'll talk a little bit about how this looking to the other world, looking to heaven, looking beyond the veil, looking like a scanner darkly kind of thing also. And how that yellow sign kind of confuses that area, and what Hastur's role is that in there. So this Disclosure, Volume 2. Disclosure, Volume 3, again, you have Azathoth at the heart of the universe. He's the nuclear mad god at the center of the universe. And of course, all things nuclear have to do with eventually alchemy, right? So the idea of matter being formed, star engines, matter, the sort of great cosmic center, the mad patriarch, in a way, of all the Cthulhu mythos. And then it goes right into cross topic with things like Jungian alchemy and the alchemical process and alchemists in general, and what is the goal of all of these mad creatures. So this is the trilogy. But today, when we're talking about Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, we'll also be talking about its relation to Moldenhauer's psychoanalysis of R'lyeh. So again, Giuseppe Balsamo's trilogy is the second trilogy around Cthulhu journals out of Lovecraft's Providence that starts with Genealogy of Cthulhu, the psychoanalysis of R'lyeh, and the archaeology of Yog-Sothoth. So the idea of these 3 books that come before is they are a study in Moldenhauer's study of the Cthulhu journals, which have some fragments, just some Lovecraftian themed texts that perhaps Moldenhauer had written, perhaps Bensimagos wrote them, we're not quite sure. Moldenhauer goes into all the origins of the texts there. But it's quite fascinating because, again, even if the texts are symbolic of a topic that Moldenhauer is trying to talk about, using the idea that Lovecraft is perhaps talking about maybe a Gnostic version of reality. Right, so Genealogy of Cthulhu takes us beginning on this journey with the origins of Cthulhu and the origins of these fragments, some of which are purported in Necromancy of Nyarlathotep to be written by Nyarlathotep himself. And then finally, the last volume, Archaeology of Yog-Sothoth, again is akin to Alchemy of Azathoth in the sense that what are the archaeological strata of the mad occurrences in Lovecraftian mythos. But with psychoanalysis of Rillier, and the reason why this book resonates the most with Necromancy of Nyarlathotep is this one begins the voyage of studying these translations of the Necronomicon fragments. Right, so by studying these nonsense texts in a way, or texts in Rillierian speech, Moldenhauer comes upon some translations, and then Balsamo doubles down on those same translations, and that's where we get the idea of disclosures from the fragments. So we'll kind of jump into these today, focusing on Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. So we'll start out with the table of contents and just kind of give a quick review of this. We start out with the forward to the series, much like I have discussed already. We go into the Ontologies of Lovecraft's Nyarlathotep. We have two references here to Nyarlathotep. Don't fail to see Nyarlathotep if he comes to Providence, said Lovecraft in his letter to Samuel Loveman, that he had a dream of the name Nyarlathotep. If he comes to Providence, don't fail to see him. He's horrible, horrible beyond anything you can imagine, but wonderful. He haunts one for hours afterwards. I'm still shuddering at what he showed. So Nyarlathotep arrives in the city in H.P. Lovecraft's story, and then you see that people are kind of enthralled by him. There's something Egyptian about him, but then again, that's maybe just an avatar, and he really is, linked back to his role as like the crawling chaos, right? This entity that's much more ancient but walks the earth. Moldenhauer takes us again back to the contents. We have a couple of milestones here to call out. So first of all, we're talking about John Dee and the Language of Angels. John Dee's work in angelic script. Then there's some discussion of the Necronomicon fragments from the Cthulhu journals, and again, there's some retranslations of those, different translations than Moldenhauer gave. These are translations provided by Balsamo. And from there, we talk about, so the idea of dead languages, the idea of cults of Cthulhu, cults of Nyarlathotep. Then we get into the idea of necromancy and this confusion between necromancy and resurrection. So the idea is raising one from the dead and also resurrection. So we have dying and rising gods, but then we also have the undead, vampires or zombies. Right, so there's a bit of a confusion there. And the other confusion there is this sleeping confusion. I just wanted to pull quickly out this Rudolf Steiner's outline of occult science. He has this chapter called Sleep and Death. And it says, all living things, a study of what lies behind sleep and death is only morbid if it produces weakness and aversion to the realities of life. Admittedly, moreover, much that has claimed the title of occult science is in part pursued today under this name bears an unhealthy stamp, inimical to life. But the true science of the supersensible does not give rise to anything unhealthy. The fact is rather this: a person cannot always be awake. And so too with death. All living things are subject to death. And then he goes into the talk about the astral body. And he says, a pendulum returning to middle after swinging to the left will swing to the right through the momentum from the left. So it is with the astral body and the I or the ego. So this sort of like, when we have these strange occurrences of, for example, even death may die, right? We have that couplet, or dead dreaming Cthulhu, right? These kind of introduce Balsamo to some of those writings from Moldenhauer that talk about how one can see the spectrum between sleep and death, between waking and sleeping and dying, and also between after living and living, an afterlife, a resurrection to this life, a life in another world. There's many of these concepts that seem to be rooted in a confusion of language, and hence this is why they're such powerful metaphors in Lovecraft around fear, right? We don't really know all these mechanisms, and even as we try to look at them, they're still elusive. So some of these are the disclosures that we're talking about. Then we talk about resurrection as the rising of Atlantis, right? The rising of R'lyeh, right? We have the psychoanalysis of R'lyeh in many, many ways is the idea of R'lyeh will rise, Cthulhu will rise. And these, we can take them psychologically to say that we have an innate sense of our unconscious that can become conscious. That's like a sort of a shadow work view of it. But if there's an esoteric view of this, right, what is this dying and rising God from mythology? What is this resurrection? And the metaphor here is in the Atlantean rising. That's posited in a fearful position as R'lyeh rising, right? It's almost a cautionary tale. Don't let Atlantis rise again. Don't let R'lyeh rise again, right? This rising action, the rising action is something to be noted. And then finally in we talk about when the stars are right? When the stars are right, is when the R'lyeh can rise. And here, Balsamo here brings us, Moldenhauer wrote the introduction to this, by the way, and the foreword to the series. The introduction is by Balsamo. But in the When the Stars Are Right, R'lyeh, Atlantis, and the Emerald Tablets, it says, was H.P. Lovecraft channeling or remote viewing Atlantis when he conjured R'lyeh from his imagination? Knowing what we do of both Dr. Dee's scrying of the Enochian script and Edgar Casey's method of reconstructing history psychically, this is a possibility. It calls into question the naming of a thing versus the comparison as a symbolic topic laboring to find language. From this mer de noms, as with the similarities of all the words deities across the religions, are there not many sun gods and mountain gods and gods of the dead and gods of the underworld? And similarly, there are dying and rising gods from Osiris to Jesus. So can Nyarlathotep be a forgotten bridge back to Egypt and Atlantis, beyond the possibilities of Lovecraftian pantheon? And here we go into the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, and the history of Thoth, the Atlantean, and a number of interesting topics to be explored in this space. And finally, we leave us with the key of how history is shaped and what is the implications of Nyarlathotep sort of today, given the fact of we're at a time where knowledge is so freely available, and how it's getting easier for people to communicate, like-minded people to communicate across these topics. So in some way, the disclosure from the Necronomicon fragment of Volume 1 really is exposing this complex ecosystem between sleep and living, and the myths of dying and resurrection, and the fearful myths of necromancy, right? And maybe on a leading edge of something that's yet to be known, but maybe less to be feared. And that's kind of where the disclosure part comes out of it. So hopefully you guys thought this was interesting. Would like to do a follow-up review of Hermeticism of Hastur, the Volume 2 and Volume 3 Alchemy of Azathoth as well. make up the set. They definitely are building upon the works of Moldenhauer, and hopefully you thought this was interesting. I will also be doing a version of a podcast to talk about necromantic concepts in the Bleach saga, and we can discuss that with Vizards and Arankar and the idea of the hollows. So I'd like to bring in a Bleach concept here, and also we'll be talking a bit about this nature of undying with the Dune sequels, and where we have the Golas and the Duncan Idaho character. So definitely would like to bring this around to a future podcast. So hopefully you guys would like to see that. Thanks a lot for watching. It's a quick take. Check out the links below if you're interested in Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. And as usual, helps to support the channel. And thanks a lot for watching. Bye-bye.